Hello, and welcome to a live chat on the More Freedom Foundation. Today, we are very excited to have Christopher Davidson, the author of Shadow Wars. Christopher Davidson is a British academic. He has lectured in multiple countries, from Michigan to Japan and all points in between. He's the author of 6 books on the region. An expert on the Gulf monarchies, is among many, many other things. Most importantly for this channel, he wrote Shadow Wars, a book that had tremendous influence on the work that we've been doing over the past couple months. I had been working on my Everybody's Lying About Islam series, video series, and essay for years, frankly, and was not certain about these things that I was trying to put out there, was having trouble finding the framework, the way to talk about all these things that I'd suspected for a very long time. And I was delighted to find Shadow Wars about 6 months back, because it not only confirmed many of the suspicions that I had, it also rigorously documented all of the issues it addressed. The thesis of the book and the claims that it makes have been described as groundbreaking, and I truly believe that it's a book that everyone should read, because the claims that it makes are extraordinary, but also rigorously documented and rigorously backed up. So I think it goes without saying that I'm tremendously pleased that Christopher Davidson has agreed to speak with us. And I'd also like to thank Travis DeMeester, who is taking time out of the Space Tech Expo to moderate our live chat. If you have any questions for Dr. Davidson, please chime in on that chat. And in the second half of this hour-long program, we will address those questions. Thanks so much. And thank you, Dr. Davidson, for agreeing to be here. Describe Shadow Wars?
Well, first of all, Robert, many thanks for hosting me on your channel today. This is a really great opportunity, so thanks very much. It's great to eventually hear the questions from your listeners as well. Well, the Shadow Wars project is a rather large and, dare I say it, fairly ambitious one. It really began trying to look at the region today, looking at the chaos, the various civil wars, the various ongoing regime change strategies, and perhaps most sadly, the apparent resurgence of religious extremist forces. And then looking at that and trying to engage in some reverse engineering to perhaps try and better understand how we've reached this truly appalling position across most of the Middle Eastern region and broader Islamic world. What I was really trying to do is use a comparative historical analysis to go back in time, all the way back into the mid and even early 20th century, to look at how various threats and resistance to British and then later American control over resources and populations in this region were dealt with. And we can trace quite clearly how through much of the mid and late 20th century, these threats were largely led by nationalist forces and national liberation fronts that essentially we're trying to take resources and monopolies, coveted, lucrative monopolies, out of the hands of Western and other foreign companies. These were often dealt with covert mechanisms, assassinations, counterinsurgencies, etc. In some cases, they were very complicated counterinsurgencies. This was the case in Yemen and Oman in the 1960s, 1950s. In Oman's case, of course, we actually saw Britain have to put together a multinational coalition to put down a national liberation movement that even involved troops from Jordan, the Shah of Iran's navy, and many other components too. However, what we started to see, and this perhaps is the real meat of the book, as it were, was that by the late 20th century, especially with the Cold War context, it was seen as increasingly necessary for Britain and then eventually the United States to directly engage with, let's put it bluntly, Islamic extremists. They were seen as a a strategic, but of course very volatile asset that could be wielded against ultimately the secular Soviet Union and its various allies and friends, fellow travelers in the region, including many of the secular Arab nationalist governments, such as
that was one of the sort of central insights that I found so useful, because it was something that I'd sort of suspected for a while, whereas you document it. And I think we're all aware that of the issues in Afghanistan and the support for the Mujahideen there, but I think what many aren't aware of is just how much further than that it goes.
Yes, I mean, I think many of these claims, especially about the use of Islamic extremists, which of course very much continues today, albeit, as I've tried to demonstrate, through increasingly shadowy layers of proxies and intermediaries. Many of these claims today would be very much laughed out of the room as conspiracy theory if one didn't provide that historical backdrop, that those layers of earlier strategies that have very much led to this. Let's say, for example, if we were sitting doing this show or sitting in a university classroom in the 1980s, and you were to say to me, well, actually, I think the Mujahideen fighting in Afghanistan, the freedom fighters that Margaret Thatcher is publicly supporting and Ronald Reagan are publicly supporting, I think they're actually covertly funded by the CIA and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and they're actually committed to a fairly bloodthirsty, austere and severe Islamic state. You would have probably been laughed out of the room as a conspiracy theorist.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, just the how important the historical context is, because when I put up videos saying things about Syria, saying that, well, this is largely a U.S. project, the civil war in Syria, I think I get a lot of pushback and a lot of people who don't want to credit that. But if you just go back, go back 20 years, it's quite clear that this is a very established toolbox, and the partners are similar.
Yes, I think what we have to very much appreciate is that this toolbox is not just established, but it's also very dynamic as well. So the same strategy, the strategies we see very much in evidence today are much more nuanced than in the past. You know, no one's going to find the same smoking guns that we found in the 1980s or even the Balkans jihad in the 1990s, directly connecting Western intelligence agencies to groups that were later designated terrorist organizations. There's a lot to explain that. For example, the Western public's backlash to the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 has very much created an environment in the West where governments and intelligence agencies and militaries can't deal in as heavy-handed a way in the Middle East and Islamic world as they did prior to the Iraq invasion. That helps us understand why these little, powerful, highly weaponized states in the region, like Qatar, like United Arab Emirates, and to some extent Saudi Arabia itself, have increasingly been acting as the middlemen in this strategy, in some cases of their own volition, and you know, they are sovereign states. But I think very much from the West's purpose, they are states that can be corralled into many things, including, of course, buying weapons, recycling their oil revenues into the Western economies, and crucially, acting as intermediaries in these strategies.
I think I'm on a bit too far in my descriptions of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies. Be interested to see what you think. I actually put up a video saying Saudi Arabia is a U.S. colony, which was intentional hyperbole. But for me, it's difficult to imagine any of these countries outside of the context of U.S. support and protection. So perhaps a term like protectorate might apply, or does that go too far?
Well, we actually have a pretty good term, I think, that can be used. I think it would be something along the lines of Leon Trotsky's the semi-colony. In the semi-colony, we have for all intents and purposes, a sovereign state, a government with its own policies, its own international relations, but it's ultimately a client elite that seeks to exploit its own population and resources for the benefit of a core economy, a protector, as it were. This, I think, of course, helps to explain why for many years in Saudi Arabia, huge chunks of its GDP have been invested back into the West's economies. And of course, as we've seen right up until last week, huge chunks of its GDP have had to be continuously spent on largely Western produced arms. In return for that, of course, the Saudi Arabian political and economic elite have been provided with military protection on and off over the years, and we shouldn't forget as well diplomatic cover. Every time Saudi Arabia does something truly appalling, whether it's the beheading of a woman in public or the bombing campaigns in Yemen or the killing of a spiritual Shia leader last year, time and again it's provided with sufficient diplomatic cover, largely from the United States and from the UK, to allow it to remain part of the legitimate international system.
I think I was reading in one of your articles about when that Shia leader was killed. It was interesting how the conversation put forward by, I believe, the U.S. State Department and whatnot was more concerned with the fact that a Saudi embassy had been burned down in Iran in retaliation.
Well, yes, I think certainly over the past few years, the United States has essentially kept on Saudi Arabia as an ally. I mean, its significance, of course, post-shale revolution is dramatically declining. But let's not forget, it is a country with still several hundred billions of dollars in sovereign wealth assets, and still the ability to recycle a big chunk of its GDP every year into the US economy. You know, we need to look no further than the truly bizarre-looking events of the past week or so involving the first presidential trip abroad to appreciate this need to keep shielding Saudi Arabia from that kind of criticism.
It's you still there?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Bringing up the Trump's trip, there's certainly been a lot of coverage of the absurdities, infelicities, and problems with it. And I certainly co-sign all of them. I found it tremendously frustrating. But what struck me about it was less the particular manifold evils of Donald Trump than the continuity of it. It was certainly less subtle. It was certainly more blunt and less intelligent, but I think it's quite consistent with U.S. policy going back 50 years. Or would you dispute that?
I think there's certainly a lot of consistency there. Of course, the images of seeing a US president bow, do sword dances, etc., all that sort of thing, and we've seen this in the UK as well, of course, with our heir apparent, Prince Charles, doing the sword dance just a couple of years ago. So there's certainly visibly a lot of consistency there. However, I think the Trump strategy is a lot more nuanced than many people give it credit for. On the one hand, it's very difficult to predict, and of course that's a very strong bargaining position to be in when you are very difficult to predict by your allies and enemies. I would say the United States is the current White House administration is well aware of the difficulties Saudi Arabia is facing, both on an economic and a military front. Its war in Yemen is going very badly. The proxies it's been supporting in Syria are, for the most part, losing. And the various other arenas across the region where it's waging this supposed proxy war with Iran are simply not going well. As for its economy, again, that isn't going well either. And I think if you're the United States at the moment, you see Saudi Arabia as a country with very few friends. Its ability to try and create a post-US Islamic alliance with Pakistan, Egypt, Sudan, it's never really worked on its own. So Saudi Arabia is in this position where it's still got nowhere to turn other than the United States. But the United States, especially the Trump United States, sees a Saudi Arabia that's ripe for pillaging for its remaining few $100 billion of assets, which laughably include investing in infrastructure in the US economy in places like Michigan and Ohio, where that's absolutely not what Saudi Arabia needs to be doing. It needs to be investing in its own infrastructure as it tries to diversify its economy. So we get big clues of this client elite in a semi-colony locked into a sort of protection relationship with the United States. It has no choice in this matter, as far as I can see.
I'm tremendously pessimistic about the long-term prospects of Saudi Arabia. My understanding is that you sadly haven't made it there yet, but you've written at some length on that topic.
Well, I think we're entering certainly an increasingly turbulent period, not just for Saudi Arabia, but for all the oil-rich Gulf states and indeed other oil export-dependent economies. We have good clues across the world. Look at the chaos in Venezuela. Look at the downturn in Angola, the problems Nigeria is facing. Kazakhstan has even had to depeg its currency from the dollar. The Gulf states and Saudi Arabia have got a bit of time. They've got a bigger cushion of sovereign wealth assets than many had first fully appreciated, I think, in the past few years. This has allowed them to do a few things. It's allowed them to draw down upon them, to paper over the cracks in their budget deficit for the last few years. And it's also allowed them to go on the international market and sell bonds. The problem is the budget deficits are not being properly stemmed at the moment, and they're continuing to exist, while Saudi and the other Gulf states have to keep sending out a message that they're capable of diversifying their economies almost overnight, or at least over the next couple of years. Many seasoned analysts, there seems to be a consensus that this is asking too much. They're trying to do something in a few years that would really take generations to change.
Yeah, the question, I mean, the Gulf monarchies have time, but it's not limitless time. I just looking at this arms deal that was signed, I mean, sure, that's $110 billion over a number of years, I'm sure, but the foreign reserves in Saudi Arabia are only 3 or 4 times that at this point, and diminishing rapidly.
Yes, I think we need to be careful about the headline figures, first of all, about these arms deals, or in fact any sort of investment deal involving Saudi Arabia. If we look back through history, there have been grand promises, either of a particular weapons sale being however many $1 billion, or even a particular aid program being however many $1 million. But then the reality, several months down the line, is often that the final amount is a mere trickle of what was originally promised. So we must bear that in mind. Nonetheless, I think you're absolutely right. These massive deals Saudi Arabia has pretty much had to sign in return for protection from the United States have dramatically shortened the amount of wiggle room it's got left to properly launch a post-oil economy. And this is something that the average, well-meaning, hard-working Saudi citizen needs to have a good, long, hard think about. That on the one hand, their ruling elite are telling them we have a plan to diversify, we have a plan to invest in our own economy and make this a post-oil future, while on the other hand, the same ruling political class are selling the country's assets down the river to a foreign power.
I think that's a vital point. I've made a number of videos that are quite negative about the Saudi Arabian elite and the country's role in the world, but it's the individual Saudi Arabians who are as trapped, more trapped than anybody else. It's a rough set of circumstances.
Yes, I mean this is a fairly extreme case of a population which has been largely, well, to put it politely, mollycoddled in a sort of cradle-to-grave welfare system for now half a century. So, McKinsey or other international consultants can parachute into Saudi Arabia, can tell its government what needs to be done and what needs to be changed, but that's not necessarily connected to the anthropological reality of this country, where you have a population now who are accustomed and entitled to the state distributing wealth, opportunities, public sector jobs, subsidies to them. You can't take all of those away overnight and expect this population to respond well to that. We've got some very big clues already, various civil service pay cuts and bonuses, which were supposed to be removed by now as part of Saudi's vision and move forward, have had to be reinstated following public backlash, planned protests even, which are not very common in the kingdom.
Oh, that's extraordinary. There have been actual protests.
Well, on April the 21st, there were 4 planned anti-austerity protests in 4 different Saudi cities. And this is, we're not talking about revolutionary activity or anything like that, but we are talking about public activism in a country, in a political culture where that's an absolute taboo, an absolute no-no. So the government has had to respond to that, and as many would have expected, it's responded very much by reinstating some of the benefits and subsidies which were supposed to have been removed by now. So not only do we have that deep-seated structural problem that a country like Saudi Arabia has to contend with, but also we have its political elite selling off its assets to pay for foreign weapons that will probably never be used. And this represents a massive chunk of Saudi's GDP and remaining reserves.
It's interesting. I just sort of thinking about Trump and Trump's weekend in Saudi Arabia, and then what an extraordinarily flattering display it was for the Saudi elite to have the heads of all these Muslim countries coming and sort of paying homage in a way. It just had a weird thought. It sort of reminded me of Catherine the Great's tour through Crimea, where representatives and some of the members of the royal families of all of Europe came and joined her on this trip as the French Revolution was starting. And I don't want to oversell that, but it does seem like sort of it's maybe optimistically, I'm sort of beginning to see that weekend, Trump's weekend in Saudi Arabia, as sort of a last gasp for a system, a sort of last high point for a system that's in for a number of very rough years.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think certainly in the European context, we should look at what Catherine the Great did next in the greater scheme of things. But yes, I mean, we clearly have, again, with the European comparison, an ancien regime, in this case, clearly on its last legs from whatever direction one wants to look at it. It doesn't function militarily without US support. We've seen that in the Yemen case. The United States and Britain have been more than willing to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. They've provided some very limited logistical assistance, but ultimately they have not done enough for Saudi Arabia to make sure it wins that conflict quickly and cleanly. Of course, it's now a PR disaster for Saudi Arabia. On the economic front, again, however one wants to look at it or spin it, it's not going well for Saudi Arabia at all. The likelihood of its current Vision 2030 diversification program is that it simply won't work. In this context, I think we can see the Trump visit, despite the symbolism of the sword dancing and the glowing orb, the mystical orb that they all touch, and Saudi Arabia ironically launching a counter-terrorism center, which, there's a lot to talk about there as well. Despite all of that pomp and ceremony, this was essentially the new White House administration doing a massive heist on Saudi Arabia's remaining assets of a scale like we've never seen before, and I would argue on a scale that the Obama administration would have been unwilling to go along with.
I agree with that. There are definitely many aspects of Obama and Trump that are different. I mean, Obama wanted to engage with Iran. Obama at least wanted to avoid embarrassing issues, embarrassing strife in countries, that sort of thing. But are the approaches that different? I think we've seen in Bahrain this week that leaders in the Gulf monarchies are feeling emboldened by Trump's sort of unthinking support, and Obama perhaps wouldn't have provided that, but Obama was perfectly fine for the Bahrain uprisings to be crushed during 2011. I mean, is it a difference in kind or just scale, I suppose?
Well, I think Obama had set up a very finely, or was setting up a very finely balanced, competitive balance of interests in the region. He saw the Iran deal, the opening up of the Iran economy, the softening on various Iran positions in the region as being balanced by still militarily backing Saudi Arabia and providing Saudi with diplomatic cover for what it did in Bahrain, etc. In Trump's case, I think you're right. We can still see continuity. We still, despite all of the public statements Trump has been making about Saudi and how that's obviously led to Bahrain's regime having the green light to crush the Shia protesters last week. Despite all of that, I think there is certainly continuity there. Trump is still in many ways keeping this competitive balance of rivalries alive. So on the one hand, we have him turning up in Saudi Arabia, selling the weapons, but on the other hand, we have quiet statements coming out of the US administration that the Iran nuclear deal and all the sanctions coming up won't actually be completely unraveled after all. It can't be unraveled because we have Boeing, we have Airbus, we have ExxonMobil, we have a steady gravy train of European and American, Japanese businessmen turning up in Iran as we speak, signing deals or pre-contracts that were every bit as good as those Westerners were signing with the latter days of the Shah's regime. So we still very much have this balance going on in the region. And I think we have to be careful not to forget that in the face of the images we've seen over the past few days.
Well, I suppose it's kind of nice to see, for once, greed working in favor of an opening with Iran. I think that's a development worth keeping. And if Boeing's helping with that.
Yes, I mean, I was in a discussion in the United States the other week where one advisor put it to me very bluntly. He said, you know, America's relationship with Iran, and especially its middle class, which is largely prosperous, which largely likes the United States, Christopher, it's a bit like a Hollywood romance, one of those movies where at the start of the film, you just know they're going to get together at some point, but there'll be plenty of twists and turns along the road, but we all know what the last scene of the movie is going to be. To me, it very much does feel like that, where there are certainly obstacles, but I think the Iranian middle classes, those who are pushing for the opening up of their economy, have to bear in mind that they're not likely anytime soon to become the US's #1 friend. They're not likely to become anytime soon the #1 regional hegemonic power, eclipsing Saudi Arabia. Instead, the opening of their economy is going to be done in a way that's favorable to foreign companies and in a way that keeps Saudi Arabia locked into some sort of balancing act with Saudi Arabia, because that's always been the way foreign superpowers looking at the Middle East, and especially this Gulf region, have seen it. It needs to be a balancing act.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question for sure. Could we move to Yemen right now? You had mentioned that Yemen is a failure for Saudi Arabia. How do they even define success there?
Well, I think if we look back at the beginning of the intervention more than 2 years ago now, it was quite clear that the success goal would be the arrival of the government in exile, the Hadi-backed government, backed by the Gulf Cooperation Council and, let's say, the United States and Britain too. That exile administration needed to be in the capital city. More than 2 years later, it's not in the capital city. There were some efforts to get it back into the southern port city of Aden. Now, there's no doubt, of course, Aden is a great prize for the intervention. They quickly reoccupied that. It's a strategic port city. The United Arab Emirates is very interested in developing its port through Dubai Ports World Company. But the bottom line is the intervention has not succeeded in kicking out the ostensibly Iran-backed Houthi rebels allied to the former regime from the capital city.
And that ostensibly is key, correct? The alliance between Iran and the Houthis is something that's beginning to exist after the fact, rather than something that existed beforehand. Is that correct?
Yes, I think so. I think in one of my conversations in London last year, I think the discussion I had ended up with a great conclusion, really, which was that a great and objective conclusion, I should add, that whether we like it or not, looking across the region, Iran and its proxies, Iran gets a lot of bang for its buck. Whether that's a few $1 million funding here or there, whether that's a few caseloads of missiles, guns, ammunition, it gets a lot of results on the battlefield. If we compare that with Saudi Arabia and its various proxies and interventions around the region, they're very expensive, they're using sophisticated technology, and they're not delivering results, whether that's in Syria, whether that's in Yemen, whether that's elsewhere. I think from Iran's case, looking at Yemen, the evidence on the ground that at the beginning of the intervention, Iran was actively backing the Houthi rebels, that evidence is very thin. We had a few reports on and off over the years of illegal ships being seized off the coast, laden with weapons, and those ships certainly existed. However, they were almost certainly en route to Horn of Africa, including ultimately Sudan, which Iran was backing various groups at the time, and in Somalia too. So to make the case that Iran was weaponizing the Houthis in the lead up to this war with Saudi Arabia, it's a very tenuous claim. That said, I believe there is some evidence accumulating, and evidence I've certainly seen over the past year and a half, that Iran has started to support the Houthis militarily, but it does seem to be very, very low level, at least compared to the sort of support Iran has been providing to its allies, the Iraqi government and the Syrian government, which of course from Iran's perspective it sees as having to face down a much more threatening enemy.
Well, of course, I mean, Saudi Arabia and the U.S. to some extent have given Iran an extraordinary opportunity in Yemen. For very little investment, they can take a force that already exists, is already powerful, and enhance it and take credit.
Yes, ironically, Iran's weak spots are the traditional conventional armed forces of governments that are its allies in the region, and notably the Iraqi government, which of course had its military largely dismantled after the US invasion in 2003, and the Syrian armed forces, which of course have been severely depleted in the wake of vast quantities of foreign weapons flooding into the country over the past 6 years. So they've very much been the weak spots as far as Iran is concerned, and unsurprisingly, that's where they directed their support and assistance. As you say, in Yemen, their allies, their de facto allies there, have been involved in several previous conflicts, including previous conflicts with Saudi Arabia, and they've always managed to stand their ground. So they're battle hardened, and Yemen is already full of weapons and well-trained fighters who are willing to stand up to the cause.
The consequences for Yemen are just horrific. I think it's worth emphasizing.
I think where we look across the region, Yemen, Syria, Libya, to a lesser extent Iraq, these are nation states which would be very difficult to put together again. They've all ended up becoming arenas in a region-wide struggle, which of course there could be new arenas added to that anytime soon. Most likely the island of Bahrain, given the increasing instability there, and the increased likelihood Iran will start to see it as a much greater opportunity to launch another thorn in the side of Saudi Arabia.
Do you see that as likely?
Well, it's been on and off over the past few years. I've been in communication, and I've tracked various groups in Bahrain that definitely can't be described as moderate, peaceful opposition. They are essentially the vanguard of a sort of Hezbollah-like movement, and they even style themselves that way. Thus far, they've limited themselves to attacking armored personnel carriers with Molotov cocktails, filming it, putting it on YouTube, etc. So it's been low-level militant activism, but one can't help but think that the increasingly hardened sectarian edge and the increasing political violence being wielded by the actual state at the moment will embolden those groups, and will probably embolden Iran to provide them with greater support. That, of course, is entirely tragic, as Bahrain should have been a peaceful opposition movement that led to a successful political change several years ago, given that probably the majority of the population were on the street at one point. But that's very much the pieces we're left to pick up with now, several years later.
It truly is tragic to see this sort of you'd mentioned sort of Hezbollah-like movement developing, but they tried for 5 years. They've been attempting peaceful resistance with zero support, and it's I don't know if I'd use the word natural, but it's understandable that this kind of transition would happen.
Well, the problem in these long-running intractable conflicts, I mean, if we look at Northern Ireland in the early days as well, is that As the conflict drags on, as people are killed, as injustices become more frequently discussed and more obvious, you have a new generation that pushes through, especially male teenagers, that see the existing opposition organs, whether they are political parties, political societies in Bahrain's case, or whatever else, they see them as being illegitimate because they're not doing enough for the cause or for the fight. They're leading nowhere. We see this to some extent in Egypt as well, where many young Egyptians have been joining extremist organizations beyond the Muslim Brotherhood, as they've seen the Muslim Brotherhood fall on its face in the wake of the 2013 Field Marshal Sisi coup. So in this sense, these traditional opposition groups, which have largely been quietist or have attempted to use the political protest, they eventually get swept to the side by more militant groups led by bitter youth that don't see a future through the mainstream political system.
It's interesting that you mention Egypt. For me, that's the best prospect for a Shah of Iran analog, sort of Sisi in Egypt. It seems like, despite how embraced he's been by Trump and other figures, certainly on the American right, it just seems almost inevitable to me. I look at him and I see the Shah of Iran, circa 1975. The contradictions being built up in that society are just extraordinary.
Yes, I think again we have a very close parallel here with the US's position on Saudi Arabia and Iran in the 1960s and 70s. On the one hand, Saudi Arabia was an increasingly useful ally because of its religious conservatism to wield against secular forces and also its oil. But largely the Shah was seen as a secular force in the region that would be suitable for projecting the US power. And I think, again, we see this hedging at the moment. This time, it's not between Saudi and Iran in that context. It's been between Saudi and Egypt as potential #1 US Arab allies. If and when the Saudi economy collapses or Saudi Arabia starts to unravel, the United States must make sure it has another major power in the region that it can count as a formal military ally, that it can sell weapons to, that can be expected to perform some of these regional policeman roles. And I thought in many ways that picture of Trump, Sisi and King Salman together touching that orb summed it up. This was the US strategy. Their formal allies are Saudi and Egypt. One could fall very easily. They could both fall, of course. You know, the conditions in Egypt now are far worse than they were in December 2010. Let's not forget that. But the United States must not be left when the game of musical chairs stop with no chair left to sit on. So it must be backing two horses at the same time.
Interesting. So the effects and the issues, the people that are affected the most by this are the people who live in these countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, what have you. But sadly, the times when the region comes up most in the Western press are when the region has outside effects. And that, of course, I'm talking about the attack in Manchester. Do you believe it's even fair to characterize Manchester as an effect of the region, or?
I think Manchester, Paris, Brussels, take your pick. They're all essentially manifestations of blowback that's been fairly consistent over the years as a result of our half a century of foreign policy in the region, which, as we discussed earlier, has been based on the covert and sometimes not so covert assistance of jihadist groups that have been wielded against our enemies. And repeatedly, we've had to engineer situations in which these jihadist groups can survive and even grow. Safe havens, if you were, whether it's in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and Iraq more recently, with our containment strategy for the Islamic State rather than actually trying to eliminate it. Time and again, we've identified these sorts of groups as being the most effective on-the-ground fighters against the regimes we want to see overthrown. We know there'll be blowback. You know, we can look back across decades of British and American secret correspondence where our officials have put in writing their concerns and their disagreement with this strategy, predicting blowback. We've had lots of blowback. It began in the 1990s. We had Al-Qaeda formerly patronized by us, attacking the US embassies in Tanzania and Kenya, bombing the USS Cole. That was manageable, a few missile strikes, etc. 9/11 was a much more serious version of blowback, which of course briefly threatened to actually dismantle the US-Saudi relationship, but the US government at the time, under Bush Jr., played an incredibly well-orchestrated campaign of diverting public attention away from Saudi Arabia's connection to 9/11 and towards the more amorphous Al-Qaeda. And of course, those incidents of blowback have continued again and again across the years. The Manchester one is a particularly poignant example because this man was from a community which was initially offered asylum and exile in Britain, and actually at one point sponsored by the British authorities because it was seen as an extremist group capable of one day taking down Gaddafi with some degree of British assistance.
Ugh, wow. That is extraordinary. You characterized our policy towards ISIS as one of containment rather than elimination. Could you launch on that?
I mean, we have, of course, documentary proof of this now. We have the Defense Intelligence Agency document from 2012, which is extremely clear. This, of course, we should bear in mind, is 18 months before ISIS's big surge. Not only does it perfectly predict the towns ISIS is going to surge into, it also describes this so-called Salafist principality that would emerge in eastern Syria and western Iraq as largely being in the interests of our regional allies. And by that, of course, it meant Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, especially Qatar and Kuwait in this context. So we have this strange campaign, Operation Inherent Resolve, beginning in summer 2014. Very few bombs dropped across this entire territory in anger against the Islamic State, nothing compared to the level of daily strikes against enemies such as Saddam in the past, or the Taliban, or even Milosevic in Serbia. So this was, despite all the rhetoric in the Western press about Islamic State being the next Nazi Germany or devil incarnate or World War III, the bottom line was this military campaign was not a determined effort to destroy the Islamic State. That's not to say the Islamic State was not bombed on occasion. You know, we have the video footage of outlying buildings having no proof there's anything inside, having a bomb dropped on it. We have of course, the strikes around Kobani and the limits and peripheries and red lines of the Islamic State, the areas it's not allowed to progress into. But ultimately, in its heartland, especially around Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa in Syria, we have very little being done about it until very recently.
Interesting. So ISIS's use would be both as a good way to drive public interest and defense budgets, and also as something to be used against Iran.
Well, I dedicated, of course, more than a chapter to the Islamic State and its various uses and benefits. Absolutely, on an economic level, it's been incredibly good for Western business. If you were to chart the share prices of manufacturers like Raytheon, drones manufacturers, etc., one will find they reached their all-time high share prices at that time. Islamic State makes big advances and gets reported on by the Western press in spring and summer 2014. So very, very good business for the arms manufacturers, which were seeing certainly a lull at that stage. On a sort of geostrategic level, we have the prospect of ISIS becoming this Salafist principality that the DIA predicted and talked about. Of course, it was born out of earlier groups, ISI, Al-Qaeda, Iraq, whatever we want to call it. We knew it was there, we knew it was likely to grow in these conditions, and we certainly let it grow. It essentially was to become a sort of bulwark or carving out an extremist Sunni state that would serve as driving a wedge between Iraq and Syria, and thus preventing a sort of arc of Iranian Shia-dominated control stretching from Iran through Baghdad into Damascus into Beirut. If one could have an extremist Sunni Islamic State financed by the Gulf states, carved as a wedge right in the middle of that, it would greatly disrupt Iran's capabilities. Of course, as with the Taliban, as with other groups, we or our allies have historically supported. The intention will have been at some point further down the line to dismantle it or destroy it.
All right, I'd like to turn back to Shadow Wars for the moment, the incredible book that you've published. So what convinced you to undertake the project?
Well, as cliched as this may sound, about 4 or 5 years ago, on the back of the reading I'd been doing, the archival work, the interviews, and especially the trawl through the WikiLeaks archives and court subpoena documents, which, by the way, I think are one of the best sources available for political historians. As cliched as it sounds, I felt this had become a duty more than anything else. So after my research work, I set aside an entire 6 months and dedicated myself to writing the final draft of this. In total, it took about 4 years, but the actual writing stage took about 6 months. And I was driven. It ended up being 680 pages in length. There were sections I even didn't manage to include in the end, which I may try and publish in article format over the next year or two. But I saw it very much as a duty to package these various narratives, these various events and strategies into a cohesive history that would help us understand very much what we're seeing today.
And I'm extraordinarily grateful, because it's certainly performed that function for me, and I think for many other people, and hopefully more viewers of this channel. Shadow Wars, there's a link in the description to this video, and I highly recommend it. It's I also recommend, of course, my essay, Everybody's Lying About Islam, but that's fundamentally unserious project when compared with Professor Davidson's here. It's rigorously backed up, tells the story in exhausting detail, going back to Bitter Lake, the meeting between FDR and Ibn Saud, and far before as well. It's an extraordinary book. Could you speak a bit more about the time in the archives you spent? I mean, you said you were going through court cases, you're going through diplomatic cables. Were these resources difficult to come by? Were they publicly available?
Well, yes and no. Certainly publicly available. I should add that the book draws on no still classified sources or secret conversations. I don't work in that way. I don't hide as many as, well, not at least a few scholars seem to hide behind references to anonymous conversations with intelligence officials. This is not a book that does that. This is a book where everything can be followed up by the reader. There's 150 pages of notes at the end. As to whether this information was difficult to find in the first place, yes and no. It's in the public domain. There are millions of leaked cables, hundreds, thousands of relevant court documents. So in many ways, we're being bombarded with information at the moment. We're being bombarded with declassified documents. We look at the recent CIA dump of more than 2 million files. And I think there's a reason for that. It makes it very difficult for newspapers, journalists, scholars to quickly engage with it, because they are overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of information that's being dumped out there at the moment. So it really all becomes about search terms, keywords, knowing what to follow up, when to follow it up, what periods to look at. But once one has the clue, as it were, one can follow the story to its natural conclusion and start to build a story around the various files that are available, adding layer and layer of evidence as we go along. The court cases are particularly important, especially when they name names of princes, agents, etc. As for legal reasons, it's very difficult to name individuals when one is publishing a book, unless they're appearing as part of court proceedings.
Yeah, because it helps to get you around the my understanding, very much stronger libel and slander laws in the United Kingdom.
Yes, I mean, the UK, of course, has become very much a sort of haven for libel tourism. So publishers are incredibly careful in the UK at the moment. And of course, Shadow Wars very much fits in that category. You know, there's a lot I would like to have written in Shadow Wars, and a lot more I would have liked to have said about various groups, companies, individuals. But that's simply not possible under the current legal regime. That said, court cases and legal proceedings are a very, very good way to be able to present that information.
Well, heck, I'm producing from the United States. I'm delighted to put anything out there. Just let me know.
Well, that's not a conversation I'm having with you today, Robert.
Of course.
That's for you and you alone.
Of course. How has the reception been? I read many glowing reviews of the book. There was one in Foreign Affairs that just, it was so laughably brief and reductive that it bothered me, actually. I mean, how have you found the reception? I mean, have you been celebrated by your peers? Have you been discouraged in any way? Because I think it's incredibly vital, as you said, to have academics trawling through this fire hose of information. And is this the sort of thing that's encouraged, or is this the sort of thing that's discouraged?
Well, I think certainly the reception to the book has been, I'm pleased to say, much beyond my expectations. It was a humble effort to begin with, but I was delighted to be invited to both the Oxford Literary Festival and the Cambridge Literary Festival, a double bill, as it were, this year. And to me, I'd always held those events as the sort of pinnacle of academic or scholarly book publishing. So these were great opportunities. I'm very, very thankful to the festival organisers for selecting Shadow Wars for both of those truly fantastic events. Yeah, I think the reception has been very, very positive. I've had a lot of encouragement. I've had a sort of citizen army of helpers and informers who helped provide me with even more information. Certainly many helped me in building the book in the first place, but since the book has come out, it's meant I've been able to reach out to hundreds of more concerned individuals, including people who hold very high positions but can't publicly talk, to help me shape my thoughts even more sharply and clearly as I head into new projects. With regards to pushback, I mean, we're always going to expect this. Middle East politics is a very polarized debate. If this was a book on the Arab-Israeli conflict, one could expect that to be even more extreme. This is certainly a polarized debate as well. Obviously, there's a significant lobby group surrounding the Syrian rebel war effort at the moment that clearly don't take kindly to this sort of work that essentially tries to place the current Syrian conflict in the historical context of previous regime change efforts. So clearly, that doesn't go down well. On a more formal level, yeah, Foreign Affairs, published by Council for Foreign Relations. I mean, I wouldn't have guessed anything else. In fact, their reviewer is a former paid consultant of the Abu Dhabi government, but doesn't declare that in any of his reviews. So, this is no surprise.
About what you'd expect from a publication that generally opens with a full-page, full-color drone ad.
Right, I mean, I would take this as flattering more than anything else. It would be delegitimizing to me if this had won an accoladed praise from Council for Foreign Relations. So in that sense, this is to be expected. The interesting point I would make is that in those sort of cases where reviewers have tried to push back, they've both relied on falsehoods. The one case in the Foreign Affairs was that the book absurdly provided no new information, and following a complaint, that had to be amended. As a brief look that would take about 30 seconds through the extensive notes at the end would realize that's a false claim. The other case would be a reviewer working for the pro-Israel Middle East Forum, which, by the way, also publishes the Campus Watch website that keeps tracks on professors in the US that criticize Israel. Their review contained the falsehood that the book doesn't contain an index. Well, sitting right in front of me now, several dozen pages right at the back of the book. So these are pretty below the belt efforts.
Having read the book, it's as I think I've said repeatedly, it's one of the most exhaustively documented books I've ever read. There's footnotes footnotes everywhere and extensive further reading to be found in those footnotes if you're interested. Those statements are baseless. I think we're coming to the end of our allotted time. I think we'll now move towards some of the YouTube live comments, if that's all right with you.
Absolutely.
We have a question. This is from a YouTube live follower. I believe it might actually be a fellow who participates in our Reddit, which I appreciate very much. Fellow or young lady, I'm sorry, I do not know. What would Christopher Davidson's strategy be in order to get politicians in the West to wish to end our alliance with Saudi Arabia?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part of that question?
So I think, what would your strategy be in order to get politicians in the West to want to end our alliance with Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think in many ways, I think your reader can take some solace from the fact that this relationship probably won't last that much longer. I think in many ways, the relationship with Saudi Arabia is now in its final era, despite, as I said, the symbolism and visibility of the US president visiting the other week. This is essentially the US trying to scrape the bottom of that barrel now. There's not that much left in the pot. It's unlikely to be able to diversify its economy. And in many senses, the West, including the United States, is going to be liberated from its historic support of Saudi Arabia, most notably because of the current oil price, the oil industry dynamic, where there's substantial non-Saudi and non-OPEC oil out there at very low cost, with new technologies driving that forward, which will essentially weaken the position of Saudi Arabia in the international system, and in turn make it a less important ally for the West. So in that sense, we're likely to see very naturally, I think, an unraveling of that relationship. In many ways, the United States will most likely just cut Saudi Arabia adrift at the time when it's no longer needed. More immediately, what can people in the West do about this? Well, I think in many ways we have to make it very clear to our elected governments that we know there is a direct connection between the loss of lives on our streets, the blowback, as it were, we're experiencing, and our long-running historic foreign policies in the Middle East and broader Islamic region. We have to make sure that is a campaign issue, that is an electoral issue in the West, which it has not been for the past half century.
Excellent point. It's just it's been too easy. We've allowed the politicians to turn it around into a, oh gosh, I guess we need to do more. Or
well, the politicians
made another play.
The politicians have largely, well, not really the politicians, the intelligence services and the civil services have really tried to portray these blowback events as either being perpetrated by amorphous, spectral foreign entities that are difficult to pin down, or simply being perpetrated by lone wolves. Therefore, they're very difficult to stop and very difficult to repeat. We've never really, in Britain or the United States, been able to get to the point where we can have a nationwide debate on the exact links between our historic foreign policy and these groups and individuals. Most notably, the mosque funding that is permitted in Britain, Western Europe, and to some extent the United States is coming from ultra-conservative allies of ours in the region that are deliberately picking poorer parts of the Western world to gain influence in. And these are time and again the parts of Britain, the parts of France, Germany, which supply us with our homegrown suicide bombers.
Mm. Yeah, that's incredibly vital and something that's just simply not looked at. We're low on time, so I think we should quickly go through a few more of these questions. Rob said, this is from John Combs, who runs the extraordinary Safe for Democracy podcast, which I would highly recommend. User question. Rob said in his essay he's not 100% against our support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Does Davidson think that any of our interventions/supports for groups in the region can be defended either morally or based on their eventual results?
Well, I think this depends on your perspective. If you're an elected politician in the United States of Britain in the 1980s, you look at the world, you look at the Cold War context, and your priority is the defeat of the Soviet Union. So as we now know from memoirs and various interviews officials from the period have now given, they deliberately supported the groups in Pakistan and Afghanistan that were the most vicious and the most likely to bring the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan into a bloody Vietnam situation. And they succeeded in doing that. And they succeeded in ultimately drawing the Cold War to an earlier conclusion by accelerating the demise of the Soviet Union. So from that perspective, that sort of very brutal, realist Cold War perspective, the Mujahideen helped the United States and its allies win the Cold War. Whether your worldview allows you to subscribe to that a US and a Western world that's willing to deal with such groups deserves to be on the winning side of a global conflict and then becoming the world's global policeman is another question.
I feel like we could have a very long discussion on that topic. At this point in the current context, I mean, is there any real case for intervention or that you can see?
Well, I think when we have had cases for interventions where there have clearly been nasty massacres in West Africa and elsewhere, we have not seen the right to protect being invoked and intervention being launched. Instead, what we've had are several interventions, including some in the wake of the Arab Spring, notably in Libya and indirectly in Syria, which have again sort of dirtied the word of intervention. It's going to make it harder and harder for Western publics to support any kind of intervention in the future. You know, Manchester is a point in case where we're learning that the family and relatives and group that the suicide bomber belonged to was part of our intervention efforts in Libya in 2011 to help unseat the Gaddafi regime. We also need to look at the chaos in Libya, the chaos in Syria now that's been left in the wake of our supposed humanitarian interventions. Time and again, we see that humanitarian intervention is being used cynically for realist objectives. That's unlikely, I'm afraid, to change anytime soon.
This is an excellent question. There are many more questions, but this perhaps would be a good one to close on if I know you're time sensitive. What are your recommendations for those who aspire to uncover complicated, interesting stories and bring them to the public light, as you've done very well in Shadow Wars? I believe that's another YouTube live comment.
Well, I think again, you know, we have this vast amount of data swimming around us now, like never before. No generation of scholars or students or journalists has had access to anything like this, anything on this scale before. It can be intimidating, the sheer quantity of material that's out there, but one can very quickly put together very meaningful reports. Let's take the Manchester situation, for example. As soon as we learn about the Libya-Manchester connection, which, by the way, US intelligence blurted out, much to the discomfort of the the British intelligence services, as soon as we learn that tidbit, we can then go to the next step, which is to go on the WikiLeaks archives to look at government documentation that's available, court proceedings, to look at the history of our policies that have involved associating with this particular Libyan group. And then one can quickly formulate a very well-evidenced historical background to a contemporary problem. And that, to my mind, is what investigative journalists covering this region and covering the increasing blowback we're experiencing in the West, these are the kind of reports they should be putting in front of the public.
I agree wholeheartedly, and grateful to you for doing that work with Shadow Wars. We've come to the end of our allotted time. I want to thank everybody for participating. I want to thank Travis for surfacing these questions for us. And most of all, I want to thank Christopher Davidson for taking the time to speak with us. As I think I've made clear in this conversation, Shadow Wars is certainly one of the best books I read last year, and maybe for many years prior. It's been tremendously useful for helping settle my thinking on the region and what's going on, and I would highly recommend that you pick it up. I'd like to thank everyone for participating. Do you have any final words, Chris?
Just to thank you so much, Robert, for hosting me today. The questions were very insightful, and the questions from your audience were as well.
Thank you kindly. This has been the More Freedom Foundation live programming. Recommend you check out Shadow Wars. You might, if you're interested in a briefer and much less serious approach, you might want to check out my essay, Everybody's Lying About Islam, available on the Amazon Kindle. And the channel is currently going through a bit of a fundraising push that you can find elsewhere. Thank you to all listeners, and thank you to Christopher Davidson. And with that,
thank you so much.
We will sign off.